Hello all, I was having an email exchange with the chap who got in touch and asked me some quite interesting questions. And I asked him, well, maybe I should make a video on these because there's some quite good points in here, and he kindly said yes. So this video is going to be about those questions, what I think of Farage, Badenoch and so on, what I consider conservatism to really mean, and the notion of the Uniparty and so on, and a couple more questions too. So I'll start firing through those. Before I begin, I should do one of those live video things that you see people do where you can ask questions live. If you're interested in that, do let me know down below. I'll set it up. And also, while I have your attention, thank you to all those who have sent super chats. As I said in my note earlier, I didn't really know what they were. I think I must have turned them on somewhere. So thank you kindly to all of those who have sent super chats. If I didn't respond, it's not out of ingratitude, it's out of my stupidity when it comes to technology. So yeah, thank you very, very much for that. Also, if you do want to connect with me more personally and ask me anything, do feel free to join the Substack. It's more personal and spiritual development focused, more aligned with the second channel, which is linked below. But do feel free to join me over there if you do want to connect on the monthly calls. Got one this weekend actually, so do come for that. Okay, so let's crack on with the questions. Number one, do I think Nigel Farage would be a good leader? If not, why? This is, I think, something that's being shown to be true with Nigel Farage. I'm not quite sure he's a Trump in the way that Trump has a big personality, big alpha male. Even sometimes when he winds me up and moves away from, you could say, some of his grassroots promises, he still comes back and does something which makes me like him. The other day, I think he said Israel and Iran don't know what the F they're doing. And it's just that off-the-cuff authenticity he has, which I find very admirable. Again, I'm not a total Trump guy. I think I would prefer more of a traditionalist, but I don't think Farage is even getting near Trump. I think many people have pointed this out about Farage, especially with folks like Rupert Lowe. You know, can he really hold a cohesive movement together with differing perspectives? This is a broader issue on the right, actually, at the moment. You know, who can hold all these disparate movements together? Because there are so many now, and it's a bit of a shame because, you know, you can see that the vote is going to be split, and that means more Labour Party. But as I say, I wouldn't lose sleep over that anyway. What we need to look towards is a much bigger cultural and social revolution, and I do believe quite a strong leader figure will arise in Britain, and I think we'll see that across the West as well. And I think they'll all be singing from the same hymn sheet. But with regards to this question, do I think Farage will be a good leader? Probably not in the long run, no, but he's a very, very good communicator. And I do think he's serving a purpose, if only to break apart the two-party system, even if he is becoming part of it. I think even someone said that today. That was it. Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator. Now, he's very soft. Could you even call him right? I mean, centrist, really. He's almost a Blairite. Even he said he'd been around Farage and can see that Farage is getting lost in the Westminster bubble. You know, beware when you look into the abyss, because the abyss also looks into you. So that would be my thoughts on Farage. Number two, what are my thoughts on Badenoch and Jenrick? Badenoch's terrible, just terrible. I mean, every picture I see of her, she looks like some girl who's got a, some program with a corporation or a university, and she just looks so out of place, whether she's with the army or the WEF or whatever it is she's doing. She's just not a natural at all. She's a symbol of everything wrong with the Tories. I think, who was it? Was it Morgoth, maybe? The guy, he's very good. He does very interesting insights. Said that, Blair wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity, and now we're doing it back. And I think there's something to that with Badenoch figures and all that. But there is, something about Badenoch where she's basically just a diversity hire, really, and a real symbol of what's wrong with the Tories. She's not going to inspire anyone. A complete disaster. Jenrick, I don't think is too bad. I think, is it Rod Liddell recently called him Ed Davey on ketamine, which is a good way of putting it. A bit overexcitable, but I think his heart's in the right place, but probably a bit too soft for me. I don't think he's really going to go where we need to go. But still, I think if they'd gone with him, they'd stand a much better chance at the next election. I don't think Badenoch will be around for the next election. I think it might be Jenrick and trying to make some sort of deal with Farage. We'll see. Let's assume that we won't be deporting the millions of British-born people who constitute the antagonistic caustic effect on our society, that there is no going back, only through. What do you think are the absolutely fundamental issues that need to be addressed, or that we have to cohere around to have any hope of maintaining what is good about Britain? Well, I assume you mean when you say British born, the people who've come here in sort of the Blair years, or maybe even before that, the folks that got kicked out by Idi Amin and so on in Uganda, the Asian types. Well, I mean, this is one that, to me, I think balkanisation is basically unavoidable now, because I don't believe the liberal mythology is possible. So the liberal mythology on the left would be something like, well, what we live under. You just do whatever you want, embrace your own tradition, your own way, your own culture, your own tribe. But as long as you respect tolerance and diversity, we've got a happy, clappy Britain. Well, I think we all know that that is a load of nonsense. But there's a right-wing version of that, which is something more like, well, all we really need to do is try and indoctrinate people into ideas of what it means to be British, respect for Christian values and respect for British culture and all that sort of stuff. I don't really think that's possible either. I think you can always find examples where it can work, on more minor levels. There are some folks who've come here who are good people. But en masse, I just don't think it can work, because it's incommunicable. The tradition, culture, these things run a lot deeper than a bit of, brainwashing from the States. Then it needs to be what you are fundamentally, I think, for these things to work. So I don't really think these ideas of just having the sort of cohesive civic nationalist British identity is going to work. I do think for Britain to be Britain, you need the British people, to be blunt. Doesn't mean you can't have anyone else in, but that has to be the real core. So while I do think things will balkanise, and that's inevitable, things are only really held together by the mass marketing, the power of the state, and basically people's striving for material resources, that will eventually crumble, and then it will get a lot more nasty. But let's just say hypothetically, what would the fundamental issues be? It would have to be shared tradition. That would be the only way. People do adhere to a shared way of life. This is a big problem, I would say, as well, with Britain and the West at the moment. Lots on the right will say, these new people coming here have to integrate into what we are. But if you listen on the left, they'll often say, well, what are you? And I know to us that can seem a bit bizarre, but they kind of have a point. What are we now? We've been gutted ourselves. Most people don't know much about their own history, their own tradition, their own people. I'm not saying nobody does. There are, of course, very good people out there that are keeping those flames alive. But broadly speaking, we're very lost in materialism. We're more concerned about the Premier League and Love Island than other things. So we kind of lost ourselves. That's a harsh truth I think we have to acknowledge. And in a sense, as I often say, it's almost necessary to accept that we're lost, because as I did a video on the other channel the other day stating, you need to be lost in order to be found. When you can honestly say, do you know what? I don't know where I am anymore. I don't know which way's up or which way's down. That's when you start to actually seek for deeper answers, start to really question, who am I? Who are we? What do we want our world to be like? What are stable foundations we can build upon? So I've answered your question in a roundabout way there, because I just don't think that it is possible. But if I was to hypothetically give an answer, it would be you need a shared tradition to maintain a majority of British people. This is a really good question. What do I consider conservatism to be? And this is a great question because, I often speak about traditionalism, and traditionalism and conservatism are different things. Just to be clear, I'm even more complex because traditionalism splits into two forms as well. So on the one side, you have the sort of hyper-Christian conservative traditionalism, which is basically just very right-wing conservatism, which I'm somewhat sympathetic to. And then you have the more philosophical traditionalism, which is much more of a spiritual movement. People like René Guénon and Julius Evola and so on. And I guess you could say, they would argue tradition is a primordial force in life. It's almost what the Buddhists would call the Tao or the Way or something like that. It's very anti-modern. It's much more focused on metaphysics and initiations and the esoteric and hierarchies of almost spiritual order. And of course, they would also, or many of them do, believe that we don't really live in a linear line of history. We live in sort of cyclical time. And I'm very sympathetic to lots of that. I mean, elements of it. I'm more drawn towards people like Schuon within the traditionalist movement because he's a Christian mystic, and I'm very drawn to Christian mysticism. But the weird thing with me is the traditionalists of that type don't tend to like the right-wing traditionalists because they view them as very worldly, lost in modernity. However, I'm very sympathetic to both, which makes me a bit of a complex figure. And traditionalism, as I say, in the more worldly sense, in the more political sense, is essentially just a strong form of conservatism. However, it's not conservatism itself, which is quite a vast thing. But my perception of conservatism personally, I don't really buy a lot of the modern stuff. I think that, you could argue the One Nation Tory stuff, I think that was Disraeli, wasn't it, who came up with that, is a more modern iteration of conservatism. I am sympathetic again to elements of that, but broadly speaking, my understanding of conservatism goes back to Burke, and I would highly recommend anybody who's interested in conservatism, who hasn't already, to at least familiarise yourself with Burke's ideas, most famously on his masterwork, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now, people do speak about that book like it's an absolute classic, but I found it quite hard going. He's waffling a lot. It takes a while to get into it. But the core points he's making are very, very strong. And I suppose the core takeaway from Burke's work would be, well, two things for me. Number one, the idea that you are gifted a society, a civilization by your ancestors, and it's your duty to try and foster that civilization, to really keep what works, to keep the vitality there, to keep the structures there so it can continue to thrive and you can pass it down to your descendants. And ideally, that's how you keep a civilization moving. I think that's bang on. Of course, we've moved completely away from that now. It's seen as racist and evil to think in those terms. But I think Burke was right about that. Burke also, I think, most famously was made his name for the critique of the revolution in France being this sort of total revolution, in that you just, obviously you chop the monarchy's heads off, but you really destroy the institutions as well. It's wholesale, everything goes. In a way, of course, you can probably see the revolution in France is very much a precursor to communist ideas, and it's really part of the same strand of thought. On the one side, I think it goes to that. On the other side, it's more liberalism that we have now. But in principle, it's this total revolution. Whereas Burke was saying, look, some people think he was saying no change. He wasn't saying that. He's saying you can have change, but it needs to be gradual, and it needs to almost integrate itself into the institutions that pre-existed it. So you have almost this steady, natural growth instead of this forced change, which is extremely radical. Now, with that, Burke also touched on to some ideas where you could say there was an element of traditionalism of both kinds I described. Inherited customs, institutions, practices, these sorts of things, social hierarchy as natural, both spiritually and politically, and so on. And the idea of organic society, it's almost a living, breathing thing, rather than the contract, which is more the sort of Rousseauian idea, again, a key part of the French Revolution. And with that, the idea of moral order is a big thing in Burke. Religion is central, and that has to be a core part of our social foundations. I think this is what many of the sort of populist right types say when they will utter the words like, we're a Christian country, or we have Christian values. And many of them don't really know what they mean on a upfront level, but there's an instinctive level there. And what that is Burkean conservatism, because it's very strong on that. Like our foundation is in the church and the religious norms that are in there. And you can see, how that plays out in society with regards to marriage and gender norms and so on and so on. Now, I would say add another layer on that and say, look, my belief would be, as a more classic traditionalist, that there's also an element of the sacred order working through there into the moral order of the institution, which is the church, and then that gives birth to the society. They're not just ideas, there's something bigger than ideas. I've said this before, it's a difficult one to get your head around in modernity, but traditionalism or tradition, especially Western tradition, it's more than an idea. It's not just my idea versus yours. Tradition is deeper than ideas. It's a way. That's the better way to understand it. Anyway, long answer there, but a good question. The notion of a Uniparty, the Tories and Labour and likely everyone else are strains of the same. overarching march towards a globalist, anti-national future of presumed superiority. Where did this uniformity of vision come from? How is it maintained? Is it a conscious assumption gained on whole cloth with power? Is it from self-interest? Yeah, really good question again. I'm maybe not the best channel for this. There are some very interesting figures on the online right speaking about where all of this came from. But my understanding of it, thinking about these things, reading around it over the years, it's just the concentration of power. And it's why I speak a lot about, on this channel, about why you have to think about things beyond election cycles. We have to think about things on the Western-wide level, because that's why the Uniparty is the way it is. It's why Farage is getting sucked into it as well. Because when you get close to the corridors of power, it just makes you part of it. It sort of eats you up, and then you become it in many ways. You're like a zombified by it. Now, how this works really goes back to the very core of our system, and there are different theories as to why. Some people will argue, it's ideas. Certain ideas post-World War II dominate the idea of, we're this liberal Western world now, and we're never going back to the, quote, extreme ideas of the past. Well, what that essentially does is creates very firm boundaries around anything that's outside of moderate, rational, humanist liberalism, and done a very good job of scaring people away from thinking anything differently. Now, I think that is true, but I think probably a more convincing example is the economic argument. And in a sense, this has got some flavour of Marx about it. Marx famously said it's the base and the superstructure and so on. The base is the economic reality, and then the ideology follows on from that. Now, I think there's something true about that with how we look at the modern world with regards to money power, because look, we have to understand the power of some of these bankers now and some of the international finance capital head honchos. I mean, they have immense wealth, immense power, and really they do have I wouldn't say it's a direct control over the governments in the West in order that they just give them orders, but it's more the way the economy flows. If you step out of line, you'll be immediately ousted, and they'll create an absolute storm around you. So it's effectively, we are controlled, but a lot of it is just the power of the market and the figures therein. Now, what that means is down the line, as I've said, this is where this kind of left-right dynamic has been somewhat artificial, because the right very much argue for, free markets and so on, which in a sense just gives power to these big names at the top. And the left will argue for, the West is racist and blah, blah, blah. But what you'll note is the power structure actually is fine with both of those, because it's social liberalism, liberal markets. That's their ideal. And you can see why both the left and the right have been serving the wants and needs of power there. And this is why very little changes when a different party comes in. I'm not a fan of Jeremy Corbyn's politics, but I can respect him as a person because he is at least himself. Now, I think he's wacky, don't get me wrong, but he is his own man and he believes what he believes. But he was never seriously going to get near power because the whole of the Western structure would be against him, just like it would for a right-wing figure. That's why, again, Farage will have to be detoxified, So, in essence, there are parts of self-interest, there are parts of people looking for power within it, but you have to understand the power of the structure behind things. You could call it money power. This, again, is something that traditionalists will speak a lot about. In fact, there's a very good book, which is a good intro to this, called Traditionalism. It might be the last revolution or the only revolution or something like that. It's worth checking out that book because he explains it very, very well. How essentially money power has really just grown up in the Western world for a long, long time, moved us away from our actual tradition and taken us into the material world. And now it basically dominates. And this is the structure that all of the Western nations have to follow. It's why they all have the same ideology. It's because they'll get the backing from the powers that be and so on. So, yeah, in essence, it's the power structure behind the scenes, money power, but then also that plays into a lot of these organisations, the UN, the World Economic Forum, and so on and so on. And that's where you really get that blend of the money power ideology, but with that, the managerial state as well. So you get the sort of left liberal ideas get thrown in there. And that works very well on two levels. One, because if you like, it placates the left and lets them think, oh, this social growth and so on. But on the flip side, what it also allows to happen is it builds what you could say is, again, these modernist figures where they seem, if you like they're on your side, like they're somehow think about the same things that you do. But in reality, it's just the marrying, if you like, of money, power, and the contemporary leftist liberal ideology. It's all a bit of a smokescreen, really, once you break it down. So I hope that one makes sense. As I say, there are some people on the online right speaking about this in a bit more detail. I think Academic Agent is quite hot on that. Keith Woods as well is quite good on it. Anyway, yeah, these are my thoughts. If you do want to ask me any questions, do feel free to get in touch with me. If you want to speak to me in person, or at least in person on a Zoom call, do join the Substack. It'd be nice to see you there. Other than that, if you're interested in personal spiritual transformation, check out the sister channel. Other than that, enjoy the rest of your day. Do sub if you're new. Take care. Bye-bye.